The conductor's voice faded behind the hissing of the train as the last puff of steam curled into the crisp Colorado air. Lila Mae Carson stood frozen on the wooden platform in Durango, her traveling trunk beside her, a brown paper parcel clutched tight to her chest. Inside it were her grandmother's cracked clay pot, her skillet wrapped in cloth, and the spoon that had passed through 3 generations of women. The only things she had left. She'd worn her best calico dress, pressed the wrinkles out, until her fingers ached and braided her hair twice this morning. She had imagined meeting her husband-to-be under the wide sky, perhaps with a horse behind him, and dust on his boots, his eyes wary but kind. She'd imagined placing her hand in his and beginning a life not grand but honest. Her heart had carried that picture all the way from Missouri through miles of train smoke and silence. But no one waited. One by one, the other passengers were claimed, by husbands, by cousins, by merchants with names scrawled on signs. Lila remained, her stomach twisted with the slow realization that something was terribly wrong. She turned toward the station master, who was already halfway through locking the ticket window. "Excuse me," she said, forcing strength into her voice. "I'm looking for Elias Crowther. He sent for me. A bride letter. He was supposed to meet this train." The man frowned and rubbed his beard. Crowther. He glanced at a list pinned near the desk. "Miss, I'm sorry. Elias Crowther passed about 3 weeks ago. Caught a fever, didn't recover. Ain't no one here by that name now." Lila stared. The noise of the train yard dulled behind a ringing in her ears. "You're certain?" she whispered. The station master softened. "I'm real sorry, miss. You must have been comin' as his male bride." She gave a stiff nod, though the words chafed. He sighed. Folks thought it odd, him sending for someone so late in life. He'd been reclusive since his wife died in that barn fire up north. Real quiet man. Guess he didn't get to set things right before he passed. Lila didn't know what to say. Her throat burned. She turned away before the man could pity her further. Snow dusted the mountains in the distance. The late autumn wind crept beneath her collar. She didn't have enough coin to buy another train ticket back east. Even if she did, there was no one waiting for her in Missouri. She had sold her mother's ring for the fare here, closed the door on a house full of memory and regret, and boarded that train with nothing but hope folded into her apron pockets. And now that hope stood splintered on a rail platform, staring down the barrel of a future with no home and no name attached to it. The boarding house was full. The innkeeper gave her a hard look and muttered about single women being bad luck when they show up unclaimed. She spent the night in the abandoned corner of a freight shed, wrapped in her coat, the cold gnawing at her knees. Rats rustled under crates. Her breath came in white puffs. She kept her parcel clutched to her chest, terrified someone might take even that. Morning arrived without mercy. She bought a biscuit with her last 2 coins and sat behind the general store, chewing it slowly, each bite dry and bitter. A few townsfolk passed her without acknowledgement. One woman whispered something sharp to her husband. Lila heard the word desperate hissed like a curse. Maybe she was, but desperate didn't mean weak. By noon, Lila made her choice. She tore the address from the crumpled letter still in her coat pocket. Crowther Ranch, South Fork Trail beyond White Hollow Ridge. Maybe there was someone still up there. A foreman, a brother. A cook's position left vacant. Maybe just land where she could prove her worth. She packed her bundle again, tied her coat tighter, and walked toward the mountains. The trail cut along the edge of the San Juan Valley, the kind of land that stretched like a prayer. Pines clung to steep slopes, their dark arms reaching toward the sky. The wind bit at her face, but her steps did not falter. For hours, she saw no one. Her boots pressed into frozen mud. Her hands ached from gripping her bundle too tightly. Hunger came on fast by evening, then worse by nightfall. She found shelter beneath a bent cedar tree, its branches gnarled like arthritic fingers. She built no fire. She had no matches to spare. She chewed on dry cornmeal from the bottom of her satchel, swallowing hard against her thirst. Above her, stars blinked coldly in an unforgiving sky. She whispered, "God, I know you're busy. But if you're listening, I need this to work. I just need one chance." Her voice cracked. The silence swallowed it whole. The second day, she passed a ridge where smoke curled in the distance. For a moment, her legs weakened with hope, but it was only a trapper's cabin abandoned and shuttered. She drank from a creek and used her last rag to wipe grit from her face. On the third day, her knees buckled on a hilltop. She thought she might collapse from the ache in her bones, and then there it was. In the shallow valley below, nestled between two long ridgelines, sat a wide ranch carved from pine and stone. Fences curved across the land like stitched thread. Smoke rose from a chimney. Horses moved in the corral. A barn stood strong and tall, its roof scarred by weather but holding firm. The ranch. It was real. Lila didn't cry, though her throat tightened like she might. She pulled herself upright, straightened her coat, and adjusted her braid. She couldn't arrive looking like she'd lost the fight before it began. As she walked down the slope toward the gate, two ranch hands straightened up from their tasks and turned to stare. Their eyes took in her tattered dress, wind-chapped skin, and thin shoes. One called out, voice low and incredulous. "Who are you?" Lila drew herself tall. "My name is Lila Mae Carson. I came here to marry a man named Elias Crowther. But he's gone now. So instead I've come to offer what I have left, my hands, my food, and my promise that I can earn a place here." The men glanced at each other. "You're too late. The cook left weeks ago. Boss won't want you." "I still want to speak with him." The air behind them shifted. A heavy presence moved into the doorway of the barn. The man who emerged was tall, broad-shouldered, and silent. Shadows hung beneath his eyes like a man who hadn't slept soundly in years. A touch of silver streaked his dark hair. His stare pinned her in place. "You're looking for work," he said. "I am." "You any good?" "I'm not worth much, sir," she said quietly, "but I can cook." His eyes flicked to the skillet handle poking from her bundle. A long silence passed between them. "1 week," he said. "Food's good, you stay. If not, don't let the gate hit you on the way out." Lila nodded, holding back the tremble in her hands. She didn't bow. She didn't plead. She just stepped forward because the fire in her wasn't gone yet. The wind pulled at the edges of Lila's coat as Buck, a broad-shouldered ranch hand with sandy hair and a worn hat, led her toward the bunkhouse. His voice carried over the crunch of frost-covered dirt as they passed rows of fencing and the low, huddled shapes of cattle. The ranch stretched wide beneath a slate sky, silent and watchful. "This here's the cook's quarters. Ain't fancy," Buck said, pushing open a wooden door with a creak. "But it's warm and the roof don't leak." Inside was a narrow room, bare walls, a cot, with a folded wool blanket, a crooked-legged table, and a single stool. A small window looked out toward the main house. It was sparse cold and smelled faintly of smoke and flour. To Lila, it looked like a palace. "I've never had a room to myself," she said softly. Buck glanced back at her, brow lifting. "Well, then I guess this is a start." She set her bundle down carefully on the cot. Her fingers brushed the skillet handle through the cloth, grounding her like a prayer. The scent of pine wood drifted faintly through the open window, clean and sharp. "Kitchen's this way," Buck said, stepping back outside. She followed him across the yard, her boots still damp from days of walking pressed into the frost-bitten earth. The other ranch hands watched from the corral, their gazes flicking from her to Buck, then to each other. One young man spat into the dirt and turned away. Another gave her a long, curious stare that made her throat tighten. Inside the kitchen, heat washed over her skin. The space was wide, an orderly stone hearth on one wall, a broad iron stove at the center, worn wood counters, and shelves lined with jars, tins, and sacks. A back door led to a garden now wilted from early frost but well kept. 2 deep sinks gleamed in the dim light. "You'll find what you need here," Buck said. "We eat at 6 sharp, morning, noon, and night. That's 18 men plus the boss, 19 mouths." She nodded, already scanning supplies. Flour, beans, dried herbs, salt pork, potatoes, onions, eggs, butter hard from cold storage, a few apples, not much, but enough. "You sure you're up for this?" Buck asked, not unkindly. "I've fed harder men with less," she said, her voice steady. He gave a short nod. "Then I guess we'll find out." She spent the night sleepless. The cot creaked beneath her as she lay staring at the ceiling, heart hammering. The pressure of the 1-week trial pressed down like a stone on her chest. This wasn't just a job, it was survival. If she failed, there'd be no next ranch, no safety net. Just the trail and the cold and that terrible hunger that scraped her insides raw. Before the sky lightened, she was up. She washed her face in icy water from the wash basin, tied back her hair, and took a deep breath that trembled on its way out. In the kitchen, she tied on a fresh apron and lit the stove. The fire flared and caught the heat, waking the space like breath returning to a still body. She moved quickly, but not with panic. Her hands remembered the rhythm. "The only thing I've got left is the way I cook, and I'll keep walking until someone's hungry enough to see it." She stirred flour and salt with baking powder, her grandmother's spoon moving through the bowl like it had a mind of its own. She let the dough rise while she chopped onions, garlic, and slivers of salt pork, setting them to sizzle in the cast iron pan. The smell spread like a memory, warm, meaty, rich with care. She beat eggs with milk and added a pinch of nutmeg, not enough to overpower, just enough to make a man pause and wonder why his mouth remembered it. The coffee brewed strong and dark, thick enough to wake a dead man. She poured it into the heavy tin pots and ladled eggs into pans, then slipped the biscuits into the oven and watched them puff and brown. By the time the sun lifted over the ridges, the dining area was warm with the scent of something deeper than food. It smelled like comfort. The men filed in slowly, half-awake boots, muddy hands, calloused. They sat without words at the long table used to silence and bad meals. The first man reached for a biscuit, still steaming. He took a bite and stopped chewing, his head tilted, his brows raised. "Well, I'll be damned," he muttered, reaching for another. A second hand bit into his eggs and gave a sharp nod. "These taste like someone cooked 'em for someone, not just dumped 'em in a pan." One by one, the table came alive. Knives scraped against plates. Heads nodded. Someone chuckled low and surprised. "These biscuits are better than my ma's," one man said. A younger one grinned. "You say that every time a woman feeds you." "Yeah, but this time I mean it." Lila served quietly, keeping her eyes low, her posture straight. She didn't smile. Not yet. She needed to see what happened next. Clara Boone arrived just as the plates were being cleaned. Older than the rest, with steel in her spine and gray in her braid, Clara watched Lila work without a word. Her eyes were sharp, her mouth drawn. A silent judge. "Miss Carson," she said flatly. "You cleaned the hearth. It was dusty. You boiled water before cooking, old habit." Clara sniffed the air, Smells like a home in here. I hope that's not unwelcome. Clara's mouth twitched almost a smile. We'll see. Buck came in last, carrying a tray with a biscuit, eggs, meat, and black coffee. I'll take this to the boss. Lila's hands stilled. Buck gave her a quick glance. If he finishes it, you'll know. She stood by the sink, drying her hands on her apron, heart pounding. She heard the floor creak as he disappeared down the hallway. The ranch hands lingered longer than usual, talking, laughing. Some even helped stack their plates. Clara nodded once and began wiping down the counters. Levi Redhawk entered, silently glanced at Lila, and then stepped past her to the stove. He didn't speak, but he refilled his cup with coffee and took a long, slow sip before nodding once and leaving again. It was the only approval she needed from him. When Buck returned, the tray was empty. Clean, he said, setting it down. Didn't leave a crumb. He didn't say more, but the look he gave her, half amused, half amazed, was enough. Lila didn't exhale until the kitchen was quiet again. She pressed her hands to the counter, closing her eyes. The first meal had landed, but her heart knew better than to rest easy. The man who'd eaten that food hadn't spoken to her since, and the glances from some of the younger hands were starting to stretch too long, tinged with something that had nothing to do with biscuits. She had fed them, but she hadn't earned her place just yet. The frost hadn't yet melted from the grass when Lila stepped out into the morning light, apron tied tight around her waist, arms wrapped around herself to fight the cold. Her breath came out in soft puffs, curling upward toward the pale sky. She stood there a moment, letting the chill bite her cheeks, reminding her she was still here, still standing. The second breakfast came together smoother than the first. Her hands moved without hesitation, flour into bowl butter cut in with practiced fingertips, eggs beaten while the stove snapped and hissed with life. Clara passed her once, pausing just long enough to give a curt nod. Lila caught it, tucked it quietly into her chest, like a folded scrap of hope. The ranch hands shuffled in just before 6. Boots stomped chairs, scraped mugs, clinked against the long table. They were louder this time. A few greetings muttered, a couple nods. She didn't smile, not yet, but she met their eyes when she served them. Levi Redhawk entered last. He moved differently than the others, slower, quieter, like he didn't need the world to notice him to control it. He poured his own coffee, then leaned against the far wall, sipping and watching. Always watching. Buck caught her eye. Same as yesterday, he asked, tray in hand. Extra biscuit, she said. I brushed it with the syrup from the canned peaches. Buck smirked, trying to sweeten the bear. She said nothing, just handed him the plate. He disappeared down the hall, the door swinging gently behind him. The men were nearly finished when it happened. A voice, oily, smooth, and thick with suggestion, cut through the chatter like a rusty blade. Well now, ain't she got a pair of fine hands? Lila didn't turn, but she felt every muscle in her body tighten. The voice belonged to a younger hand, one with dark stubble and a crooked grin, who'd stared too long the day before. He leaned back in his chair, arms behind his head, boots crossed at the ankle. I'll bet she stirs a pot real nice, huh? Laughter scattered around the table. Not loud, but sharp enough to sting. Lila set down the coffee pot carefully, her fingers gripping the handle until her knuckles whitened. Her pulse thudded in her ears. She stared at the wall ahead, willing herself to be still. The man wasn't finished. Maybe she ought to sit with us sometime. Let us get a real taste of what she's cookin'. More laughter. Heat burned in her chest. Her jaw clenched so tight it ached. She turned slowly, not looking at him, not looking at any of them, just walking toward the stove where the last pan of biscuits sat untouched. She focused on the heat, the fire, the hiss of the skillet. Behind her chairs creaked, boots shuffled, the laughter started to fade, and then silence, a heavy silence, dense, cold. Footsteps echoed from the hallway, slow, deliberate. Lila turned. Elias Crowther stood in the doorway. He hadn't shaved. His shirt sleeves were rolled past his forearms. His eyes, dark as burnt oak, swept the room like a blade. No one spoke. His gaze settled on the young man still lounging in his chair, the grin on his face now uncertain. Enough. Just one word. But it hit like thunder. The man's straightened eyes darting. We were just... I don't care. Elias stepped into the room, his boots hitting the floor like strikes of a hammer. Miss Carson is here to work. She is the cook of this ranch. She will be treated with respect. His eyes moved over every man at the table one by one. I don't want to hear another word like that. Not from anyone. You speak to her like that again, you'll be gone before your bed cools. The ranch hands said nothing. Some looked down. One or two nodded. The young man who'd made the comment shifted in his seat. Boss, we didn't mean nothing by it. Elias raised a hand. Not another word. Silence dropped again, this time heavier, final. Then he turned. His eyes met Lila's, only for a second. But that second changed everything. It wasn't just anger in his face. It was something else. Something rougher, fiercer. Protection. Then he was gone, the door swinging shut behind him. The room exhaled. The men returned to their food in silence. Plates clinked, chairs squeaked. No one spoke above a whisper. Buck leaned in as he passed Lila. He don't do that, he said quietly. Not ever. She swallowed. Her hands still trembled, but not from fear, from something else. Something warm. That night Lila cooked slowly, thoughtfully. She roasted meat with rosemary and garlic, letting it brown until the juices ran clear. She mashed potatoes until they were smooth and whipped with butter. She sliced the last of the apples, stewed them gently with sugar and a splash of cider, then spooned the warm mixture into a chipped ceramic dish. She didn't think about what it meant. She just made the food. She placed it on Elias's tray with care. One biscuit golden and soft, meat seared and tender, apples with a cinnamon crust, coffee dark and strong. Buck carried the tray without comment, but paused at the door. He don't like sweets, he said. Lila raised an eyebrow. Everyone likes something sweet, even men made of stone. Buck chuckled low. We'll see. The kitchen grew quiet after dinner. Clara cleaned the stove. Levi polished a bridle at the far table. Lila peeled onions for the next day, her hands moving slow, steady. Buck returned just before the lanterns were doused. He set the tray down empty, every bite, he said. Even the sweet. Clara looked up. Levi stopped polishing. Lila stood very still. Her heart beat slow and deep like thunder rolling in the bones of the earth. She turned back to the counter, breath catching just slightly. Behind her, Buck added, He ate like a man who hadn't tasted care in years. She said nothing, but her fingers curled tighter around the wooden spoon in her hand. The warmth that had sparked that morning hadn't gone out. It had caught. And in some corner of the house, she knew Elias Crowther felt it too. The days began to stretch with rhythm. Lila rose before the sun moved through the kitchen like she belonged there, her hands sure, her senses alert. The wood stove became her altar. The fire responded to her the way it had to her grandmother, faithfully, fiercely. There was no room for nerves anymore, not with 19 mouths to feed, and nothing guaranteed. The men arrived hungry. Some nodded. One or two even offered a quiet thank you. but mostly they ate in the focused, silent way of working men tools at rest only long enough to refuel. It suited Lila fine. She wasn't here for praise. She was here to stay. That morning, as she cleaned the biscuit board and set beans to soak for supper, Clara Boone appeared in the doorway with a broom in one hand and a look that could strip bark off a tree. "Miss Carson," she said, not quite warmly, but not cold either. Clara Lila replied with a respectful nod. Clara stepped inside, swept a bit of flour with her boot, then gave a low sound that might have been approval. "You keep a clean space. That's worth more than half the praise in the world. I was raised that way. My ma used to say cleanliness is a woman's second name." Clara leaned the broom against the wall. "What's the first survival?" Lila said without flinching. Clara looked at her for a long moment. Fair enough. She stayed to help knead bread. Her hands were stiff with age, but her knowledge ran deep, and they moved together in practiced rhythm. Lila at the stove, Clara at the table. It wasn't friendship. Not yet. But it was something close to respect. Later that day, Lila stepped outside to hang laundry in the brittle sunlight. The breeze lifted her skirt, stung her face with the scent of pine and distant snow. She clipped a damp apron to the line and turned, and there he was. Levi Redhawk stood a few yards away, arms crossed, one foot resting on a stump. He didn't speak, but she felt his eyes on her the way someone might watch a fox circle their henhouse, not out of suspicion, but out of understanding. She nodded politely. "Afternoon?" He inclined his head. "The men say your biscuits taste like Sunday." "That, so," she asked, folding a towel. "They also say your stew gave one of 'em dreams about his mother." He woke up crying. Lila laughed softly, surprised. "I don't aim to make men weep, just to make 'em quiet down long enough to taste their food." Levi's mouth twitched, maybe a smile, maybe not. Food with soul. That's rare out here. She appreciated the compliment for what it was, as simple, honest, and enough. As she turned to pin another sheet, he reached into his coat and pulled something small from inside a carved wooden feather, smoothed and painted, with delicate lines in black and red. "From my mother's people," he said. "Ute tradition. Meant for those who bring peace to a place." He extended it toward her. Lila hesitated only a second before accepting it. "Thank you. Don't lose it," he said. "Bad sign if it breaks. I'll keep it safe." He nodded once more, then turned and walked away, leaving her alone with the flapping linens and the sudden weight of something sacred in her palm. That night, she found a nail on the wall beside her bed and hung the feather there just above where her head would rest. It watched over her like a silent witness. She woke early the next day to frost on the window and a strange stillness in the air. As she cracked eggs and stirred grits over the fire, Clara entered with her shawl pulled tight around her shoulders. "Feels like storm weather," she muttered. "Wind's wrong." Lila glanced toward the window. "I thought the air smelled sharper. Storms roll fast through these mountains. Snow comes in sideways when it's angry. Good thing I've got stew ready. It'll stick to their ribs." Clara nodded and pulled a tin of coffee down from the shelf. Men'll work harder when their bellies feel loved. By midday, the sky had turned pewter. A strange light bathed the valley, too bright, too cold. Wind whipped through the eaves, whistling low like a warning. Lila stepped out to fetch herbs from the side garden, but her breath caught halfway across the yard. A deep rumble echoed through the hills, followed by a blinding flash. Lightning, sharp and sudden, split the horizon. Thunder cracked a breath later, and then smoke. It curled upward, orange and black, from behind the hay barn. She dropped the herbs and ran, Men shouted across the yard. Buck sprinted from the stables, boots pounding. Levi barked orders to get the horses clear. Flames licked the sky, feeding on dry timber and hay. But Elias Crowther, he stood motionless, just feet from the barn, his face pale as ash, his eyes wide and empty. His mouth moved, but no words came. His hands trembled at his sides. Elias Buck shouted, grabbing his arm, "We need water, the stable's next," but the man didn't move. Lila's blood ran cold. She recognized the look. It wasn't shock. It was memory. He wasn't seeing this fire. He was seeing the one that took his wife, and he was trapped in it all over again. She ran forward faster than she thought her legs could carry her, dodging buckets and horses and men who didn't know who to follow. She reached him, placed her hand on his arm. "Elias, look at me." He blinked. Once, twice. Still not here. She turned and faced the yard. "Listen to me," she shouted. The men froze. "You form a bucket line from the well to the barn. Don't stop, don't wait. You get the stable open, move the horses west toward the creek." They hesitated. Now the men sprang into motion. Water flew hissing against flames. Hooves thundered as horses bolted. Smoke curled around them, thick and choking. Lila soaked a cloth and tied it over her mouth, coughing as she grabbed a bucket and threw water into the blaze. Levi passed her another. Clara appeared at her side, eyes fierce as she shoved another man into the line. Through the smoke, she saw Elias slumped against the corral fence, head in his hands. But the fire was losing. The men rallied. The barn groaned and hissed, its outer wall blackened, but the blaze no longer climbed. Finally, it went still. Only smoke remained. The ranch stood, and Lila, arms shaking, smoke staining her face, stood in the center of it all. A woman with a spoon in one hand and a ranch full of men behind her. She didn't cry. She didn't collapse. She simply breathed. Because there was still supper to cook. The barn still smoldered the next morning. Blackened boards leaned like broken bones, the air thick with the scent of wet ash and scorched hay. Lila stood outside the kitchen door with a pail of peelings and watched the sunrise cast long shadows over the wreckage. Her arms ached. Her palms bore small, angry burns where the bucket handles had rubbed raw, but she felt steady, anchored in a way she hadn't in years. The ranch hadn't burned, and neither had she. She dumped the peelings into the slop bucket and turned toward the pump, but paused when she saw Elias. He stood beside the corral, coat, unbuttoned, boots dusted with soot. His shoulders were square, but his eyes were hollow, fixed on the black shape of the barn. A hand rested on the top rail, unmoving. The man who had once barked orders like thunder now looked like he was afraid to breathe too deeply. She didn't disturb him. Not yet. Inside the kitchen, the rhythm returned. Beans, simmering onions sizzling in the skillet. Fresh dough pressed into rounds and laid gently into the pan. Clara arrived just as Lila was sliding biscuits into the oven. Her usual tight braid had come loose, a few silver strands curling around her weathered face. "You sleep at all?" Clara asked. "Not much," Lila admitted. Neither did he. She didn't have to ask who. Clara busied herself with stacking plates and sweeping flour dust. For a while they worked in silence. Then Clara said without looking up, "You saved this place yesterday." Lila stirred the beans. "I just did what had to be done." "Well, you did it better than most men would have. And Elias Crowther ain't one to forget a thing like that." Lila didn't answer. Not with words. But something fluttered in her chest, unsure and cautious. Breakfast was quieter than usual. The men ate with a strange kind of reverence, glancing toward the burned barn but saying nothing about it. Some thanked her. One even offered to help chop wood after chores. She didn't know what to make of it all, so she simply kept moving, kept cooking, kept breathing. Later, as she washed pans, she heard footsteps behind her measured slow. She turned and found Elias in the doorway. He looked like a man standing at the edge of something wide and uncertain. His eyes were darker than usual, shadowed by something unspoken. He cleared his throat. "I wanted to say you're doing good work." Her hands stilled in the water. She met his gaze. "Thank you," she said, her voice even. He nodded once. A silence settled between them, not uncomfortable, just fragile. "The men are working better," he added. "The ranch feels different." "She makes the house breathe again, Clara, and I can't decide if that terrifies me or saves me." She didn't know what to say to that. He seemed surprised he'd spoken it aloud. She set the pan on the drying cloth. Places change when someone believes in them again. His jaw tightened. A muscle jumped in his cheek. "I thought I was past that," he murmured. "The believing part." She wiped her hands on her apron. Sometimes it sneaks back in, with a spoonful of stew or a batch of biscuits. His eyes flicked to her hands, still pink from yesterday's burns, knuckles nicked and raw. "You need salve for those. I've had worse. Doesn't mean you should keep having it." She let herself smile just a little. "Is that concern I hear, Mr. Crowther?" He didn't smile, but the corner of his mouth twitched. "I guess I still remember what it's like to care if something breaks." He turned before she could reply, and walked back toward the main house, the door swinging shut behind him. Clara, standing in the pantry doorway, said, "He's starting to look like a man again." Lila exhaled slowly. And what did he look like before Clara wiped her hands on her apron? A man waiting to die. The day passed with a strange energy in the air. The men worked harder, faster, quieter. Even the horses seemed more settled, though the barn's skeleton still smoked by sundown. After supper, Lila walked outside to gather the laundry before the dew set in. The air was cool, clean, cleansed by fire and fear and survival. She turned toward her quarters and stopped. The wooden table she'd been using, the one with the crooked leg that always wobbled, stood straight. The leg had been braced with a new beam, sanded smooth. A fresh nail gleamed in the twilight. Her breath caught. Inside, the loose window pane no longer rattled. Someone had fitted it tighter. And on her bed, resting against the folded quilt, lay a second stool. No note. No explanation. But she knew. That night, she tucked the feather Levi had given her beneath her pillow and ran her fingers over the edge of the repaired table. She didn't cry, but something in her unknotted. At dawn, the ranch awoke to another change. Elias walked into the kitchen. No excuse, no task, just a presence. Lila stood at the stove flipping griddle cakes. Clara chopped apples near the sink. Levi leaned against the doorway, silent as always. Elias walked to the hearth, bent down, checked the woodpile. "Plenty stacked," he said. "Good thing," Lila replied without turning. "Cold's coming fast this year." He nodded, then lingered, fingers resting on the mantel. He stayed through most of breakfast prep. Didn't speak again, didn't leave. When Buck entered and saw him, he blinked twice and muttered, "Well, I'll be..." Lila handed Elias a mug of coffee without asking. He took it, brushed her fingers in the exchange. The touch lingered. He sipped and said, "Strong. Wouldn't be worth drinking otherwise." He looked at her over the rim of the mug eyes, steady. Neither would most things. She turned back to the stove, heart pacing faster. Later, Clara whispered, "He'll be back tomorrow." And Lila knew she was right. The house had started breathing again, and its heartbeat, steady, quiet, constant, was warming more than just the kitchen walls. The flames were gone, but the smoke still lingered, thin ribbons twisting through the rafters of Lila's memory. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw the fire not just on the barn roof, but in Elias's eyes when he froze. That terrified, hollow look, like he'd seen a ghost. Maybe he had. She didn't ask questions the next day. She didn't press. Instead, she made roasted chicken with sweet potatoes and a pepper gravy that soaked into the meat like forgiveness. Elias didn't come to the kitchen, but his tray returned empty again. Not a crumb left. Not a smear of sauce. Just a plate wiped clean and a single folded napkin set carefully on top. The next morning, she stepped outside to find frost lining the fence rails and a heavy silence hanging over the ranch. The kind that settles in the space after something cracks, but before it fully heals. She walked to the pump with the water bucket swinging from her hands. As she bent to draw the handle, she felt it. Someone watching her. She didn't have to turn to know who it was. Elias stood halfway between the barn and the stable arms, crossed eyes locked on her. He didn't move, didn't speak, just watched her like she was something he couldn't quite figure out. A riddle he wasn't sure he wanted to solve. She lifted the bucket and walked back to the kitchen. That evening, she added something small to his tray, a baked pear drizzled with cinnamon and honey served warm and soft. She didn't know what made her do it. She only knew that sometimes sweetness had to be given quietly. Not as a gift, but as a reminder. The tray came back with a single silver spoon resting on the dish. Buck set it on the counter. He ate it. All of it. Clara, drying her hands nearby, turned with raised brows. "He don't even touch sweets," Buck added. "Said they were for the dead." Lila wiped her palms on her apron. "Maybe the dead aren't the only ones who need comfort. He ate all of it," Buck said. "Even the sweet. He don't do that." The changes came gradually. Small, silent things. The table leg that used to wobble fixed. The window that let in the cold sealed. A second shelf appeared in the pantry right where she'd been stacking jars precariously. A new potholder hung on the hook by the stove sewn from scrap cloth with surprisingly neat stitches. No one admitted to it. But she knew. Elias didn't say a word. He just started appearing more often outside the kitchen door near the barn, or walking past the herb garden she'd coaxed back to life. He never lingered long. Sometimes he didn't say anything at all, but he was there. One afternoon, as she chopped carrots, the door creaked open. She didn't turn. Checking the firewood again, she asked. "No," he said, slower than usual. "Just walking." She paused, knife hovering mid-air. "Everything all right?" He leaned against the doorframe. "I wanted to say, you did more than feed this place." She looked up. "You brought something back," he said, eyes fixed on the floor. "Something I didn't know was gone." Her chest tightened, but she kept her hands moving. "I only cook," she said. "No," he said, looking up at her. "You give order, comfort, hell, even hope. Men work harder when you're here. They joke more. They show up early just to smell the kitchen." She didn't know how to answer that, so she didn't. Instead, she said, "There's hot coffee. If you want to sit." He stepped inside. Just a few feet, not far, but enough. She poured him a cup and slid it across the table. He took it like it might break. They sat in silence, the sounds of bubbling stew and the ticking clock filling the room. Outside, the wind picked up, rustling the eaves. After a moment, he said, "The night the barn caught. I saw Mary Ellen." Her hands stilled. "I don't mean her face. I mean that feeling, that helplessness. I couldn't move, I couldn't think." Lila's voice was low. "You were in a memory." He nodded. I've lived in it for years. That fire just opened the door again. You didn't walk through it, she said. You stayed here. He set the mug down. Only because you dragged me out. She let the silence settle. Then he stood. I'm not good with words, but I notice things. Just know that. He left without another word. That night she found something else. On her bed, laid across her folded blanket, was a mirror. Small, round, old, but clean. Polished so well she could see every line in her face, every shadow beneath her eyes. A woman's mirror, meant to remind her she still existed. She sat down slowly on the edge of the bed, holding it in her lap like a gift from someone who didn't know how to speak, but knew how to listen. The next morning came sharp with cold. Snow had crept down the ridgeline overnight, dusting the pine tips in white. The air smelled of wood smoke and frost-bitten sage. As Lila cracked eggs and poured batter onto the griddle, Clara entered with a tray of washed linens. Heard he's coming to the kitchen again, she said. That true, Lila nodded. Seems like it. Clara gave her a look. You're stirring something in that man. Careful now. I'm just cooking, Lila said. Clara smiled thinly. That's where it always starts. The door creaked. Elias stepped in, brushing snow from his shoulders. Firewood stacked, he said. Lila glanced at the full bin. You did that? He shrugged. Someone had to. He moved to the coffee pot, poured himself a cup. Then, instead of standing in the doorway, he sat at the table. Clara raised a brow but said nothing. She passed Lila a towel and quietly slipped out. Elias looked out the window, steam rising from his cup. You still plan on leaving after your week's up? Lila turned toward him, heart skipping once. I don't know, she said. Depends if I'm wanted. He didn't look at her. You're needed. That's not the same. She waited. I don't know what I want, he admitted. But I know this place feels different when you're in it. She stepped to the table, set down a plate of griddle cakes with peach preserves. You should eat while it's warm. He looked up, held her gaze. Thank you, he said quietly, for more than the food. Lila nodded once, unable to find words that didn't tremble. And as the snow fell soft and steady outside, she realized something had shifted between them, not loud or sudden, but like the way a fire catches from embers, slow and sure, until one day, the whole room feels warm again. You let yourself start to care, and before you know it, the silence isn't as loud. And that's what scares you most. Lila stood barefoot in the kitchen, watching snow fall thick and quiet through the frosted window. The stove behind her hummed low, sending waves of warmth across her back. She hadn't lit the lamp yet. The dim gray of the late afternoon held everything still, like time itself was trying to decide whether to move forward. The table was set for 3. She had only meant to set 2, one for Elias, one for herself. But her hands had moved of their own accord, placing a 3rd bowl, 3rd fork, 3rd cloth napkin before she noticed. She didn't change it. Buck had gone into town. Clara was off visiting her niece in the next county. That left the ranch still and hushed except for Elias's boots pacing slow outside the porch. She could hear them sometimes, heel, toe, heel, steady, like a man trying not to think too hard. He hadn't said anything about staying longer. Hadn't said anything about her staying either. But he lingered in the kitchen now, not just passing through. He'd refill his coffee, sit a while. Sometimes he even watched her cook, though he never offered advice. Just that quiet gaze, always a few seconds longer than it should be. She pulled the biscuits from the oven, golden and splitting steam as they hit the cooler air. She drizzled honey on a few, just how he'd liked them last time, and set them in the middle of the table. The door creaked open. Elias stood there, snow melting on his shoulders, cheeks red from the cold. He looked tired, but settled like someone learning how to live again. Smells like something worth surviving, he said, shaking off his coat. Biscuits and stew, she replied. Simple things. He stepped in, hanging his coat on the peg, then paused. You set 3 places. Her hand stilled on the ladle. Force of habit, she said softly. He nodded once, but didn't ask more. They ate in relative silence, the clink of spoons and soft scrape of plates the only noise between them. But it wasn't the silence that used to haunt the ranch. This one was warmer, filled with breath and presence and unspoken things. Halfway through the meal, Elias set down his spoon. I buried Mary Ellen out by the creek, he said, voice low and rough. It was spring. The bluebells were starting to bloom. She always loved those. Lila looked up, heart tight. I didn't mark it, he continued. Didn't want the ranch folks asking. Figured if I ignored the grief, maybe it wouldn't take root. She reached out, resting her hand gently near his, on the table, not touching, just close. But it did, didn't it? She whispered. He nodded, took everything with it. Even me. Her voice stayed soft. You don't talk about her much. I don't talk much about anything. He looked at her, then eyes raw, voice almost breaking. But I hear you humming in the kitchen, and I smell rosemary and peach preserves, and I think maybe it's not wrong to let something new in. Her throat tightened. I'm not trying to replace anything, Elias. I know. That's the problem. You're just here. Like breath. Like sunlight. And that makes me forget how long I've been cold. A long silence followed, and neither of them moved. Outside, snow kept falling in thick, silent curtains. Then he pushed back his chair and stood. I need to show you something. She followed him without asking. They crossed the porch, snow crunching beneath their boots. Elias walked slow, as though weighing each step, heading not to the barn or the stable, but toward the far stretch of pasture where the land rolled gently toward the line of trees. At the edge where the fence met the woods stood a low wooden cross. No name, no date. Just a stone tucked beneath it and a small bunch of dried wildflowers tied with twine. Lila stopped short. Elias turned his face unreadable in the fading light. I've come out here 100 times, he said, but never with anyone else. She stepped beside him, her breath clouding between them. I never felt I deserved to leave this spot behind, he continued. Like moving on would mean I forgot her. You don't forget the ones you loved, Lila said gently. You carry them. But you don't have to stop living to do it. He stared at the cross, then at her. I don't know how to start again. You already did. She reached out this time, placing her hand on his. You asked me to stay. He hesitated. You didn't have to say it. They stood in silence again, but this one was different. Less heavy, less lonely. Back at the house, the fire had burned low, casting amber light across the floorboards. Lila refilled the wood bin without being asked. Elias watched her leaning in the doorway with arms crossed. I thought I was afraid of forgetting her, he said finally. But I think I'm more afraid of remembering what it feels like to care again. She met his gaze. You let yourself start to care, and before you know it, the silence isn't as loud, and that's what scares you most. He didn't deny it. That night, as she tucked herself into bed, the old mirror lay by the windowsill, catching slivers of moonlight. She picked it up, looking at the reflection of a woman she barely recognized. Stronger now, steadier, less afraid. In the hallway outside her room, she heard footsteps pause, then retreat. She didn't sleep right away, because something had shifted tonight. Not just between her and Elias, but inside herself. and somewhere in the quiet darkness she knew the next storm wasn't far. Healing had a cost, and sometimes wounds needed to be reopened before they could close for good. Sometimes it ain't the storm that breaks you, it's the silence that follows when you're still standing. The wind came in from the east, biting and fast. It carried the scent of ice and pine and something else change. Lila stood on the porch, wrapped in Elias's old wool coat, the one he'd tossed over her shoulders that morning without a word. She hadn't asked. He hadn't offered a reason, but the gesture lingered. The day was unusually still, as though the land itself were bracing. The horses hadn't stirred much. Even the cattle had clustered beneath the trees, tails flicking lazily, heads down. Inside, the fire was crackling, but the warmth didn't reach her bones. Not today. She heard Buck's voice first, echoing down from the barn, laced with something she hadn't heard in a while: panic. Elias. Her stomach clenched. She bolted down the steps, boots sliding on the packed snow, just as Elias came striding across the corral. Buck was already halfway toward him, his gloved hand gesturing wildly toward the south fence. "Gate's been cut. Again!" Lila froze. Again. The word hung there like smoke. Elias's jaw flexed, his eyes narrowing. Same spot, yup. And this time it ain't no animal. Fence wire was clipped clean. Clara came trotting up on her mare reins, in one hand, the other clutching her coat tighter. Tracks led toward the ridge. Small group. Could be poachers. Elias muttered a curse under his breath. Lila stepped forward. "What do we do?" He turned toward her, and for the first time she saw the old soldier in him come back. The man who'd lived through more than grief. The man who'd known how to fight. "We ride out," he said. "They're getting bolder. Next time it won't just be a fence." She stared at him. "You think they'll come to the house? They're testing the edges," he said. "Won't be long before they test the center." Buck nodded grimly. "We'll go. Scout it out. Won't engage unless we're forced to." Clara dismounted. "I'll stay with Lila." But Lila shook her head. "No, I want to help." Elias frowned. "It's not safe." She met his gaze, her voice steady. "Neither is waiting while you walk into something blind. Let me ride with Clara. We can stay back, watch the tree line." He hesitated. Not because he didn't believe her capable, but because the idea of her getting hurt pulled something tight in his chest. "All right," he said finally. "But if I say run, you ride like hell." "Understood." She nodded. "Understood." They saddled up fast. The sun had dipped behind the hills, casting long shadows across the snow. The ridge loomed in the distance, dark and quiet. They rode hard, the sound of hooves muffled beneath the fresh powder. Lila's heart pounded, not from fear, but from something deeper, a sense of purpose. She wasn't just passing through anymore. This place, these people, they mattered. As they approached the ridge, Elias raised a hand, signaling a halt. The group dismounted and moved carefully on foot. Lila and Clara stayed back, crouched behind a fallen pine, watching the men disappear into the trees. Silence followed, the kind of silence that screamed. Lila's breath fogged in front of her face, every muscle tensed. Clara's hand hovered near her rifle eyes, scanning the horizon. Then voices, low, sharp. Not Elias or Buck. Then a shout. A shot. Lila bolted up, but Clara grabbed her arm, holding her down. "Wait!" she hissed. More shouting. Another crack, this time closer. Lila's heart threatened to burst through her ribs. Then crashing through the brush, Elias appeared, blood on his sleeve, eyes wild. He didn't stop to explain, just waved them forward. "Go!" he shouted. "They're armed, not just poachers. Might be rustlers." Lila didn't question. She mounted in one breath, spurred the horse into motion. Clara right behind her. Behind them, more shots rang out, then silence again. At the ranch, the wind howled like something alive. Lila jumped down, rushing toward Elias as he stumbled from his horse, blood soaking through his flannel shirt. "I'm fine," he said, brushing her off, but his face was pale. "Like hell you are." She helped him inside, Clara and Buck locking the doors behind them. The barn lights were turned off. Windows shuttered. Back inside, Lila cleaned Elias's wound. "Just a graze," he kept insisting. "Just a scratch." But her hands shook. I thought she began but couldn't finish. Elias reached up, catching her wrist. "I came back," he said softly. "Don't plan on leaving again." Her breath caught. They sat together in the lamplight, neither speaking for a while, just breathing, just listening to the wind slam against the shutters. Clara paced near the fire rifle across her lap. Buck leaned against the mantel, face grim. "We'll need help," he said finally. "Sheriff's been stretched thin. But this ain't random. Someone's watching. Waiting." Lila looked at Elias. "This land. It's worth fighting for, isn't it?" He nodded slowly. "It always was. I just forgot why." She leaned against him, then her head resting lightly on his shoulder, his hand settling over hers. They were quiet, but it wasn't the same quiet from before. It was the quiet that follows after the world has shaken and you're still standing. Sometimes it ain't the storm that breaks you. She murmured, eyes closed. It's the silence that follows when you're still standing. And Elias, for the first time in what felt like forever, smiled without pain. You don't rebuild a broken fence with hope, you do it with wire sweat and someone willing to hold the other end. Dawn painted the fields in a weak gold light, touching the frost-covered fence posts with fleeting warmth. Lila stood in the mud hammer in hand sleeves rolled up, face flushed from the biting wind. She was halfway down the south line where the fence had been cut days ago. The barbed wire was taut in her grip, biting into her gloves, stubborn as the memories she kept pushing away. Elias moved silently beside her, anchoring the wire with thick nails, his motions steady and practiced. He hadn't said much all morning, but his presence filled the space like a tide rising slow and sure. After the attack on the ridge, things had shifted. There was no time for denial anymore. The ranch wasn't just land, it was a target. And the people on it were now a unit. No one said it aloud, but the air had changed. Every window was checked twice, every sound outside evaluated like a question waiting to be answered. Clara was back at the barn, checking supplies and tending to the mare that had come up lame during the retreat. Buck had ridden into town at first light to talk with the sheriff again, though no one expected much. The law out here was slow-moving and underfunded. Rustlers knew that. They counted on it. The clink of metal rang out as Lila anchored the wire into the next post. Her hands stung, her shoulders ached, but the work was grounding. Each post she reset felt like a promise she was making to herself. That she belonged. That she would stay. Elias crouched beside her, nodding slightly as she passed the hammer to him. "You're getting good at this," he said. "Turns out I've got a talent for holding things together," she replied, half smiling. He looked at her, then really looked. "You've been holding more than wire these days." Her cheeks flushed a deeper red than the cold could explain. Somebody had to. They worked in silence for a while longer, the wind whipping through the grass like a warning. Lila broke it first. "Do you think they'll come back?" Elias straightened, wiping his brow with his sleeve. "They always come back. Problem is, they usually wait until you've let your guard down." She nodded, her throat tight. "But that's not what we're doing here," he added. "We're not just fixing fences. We're showing we're not scared." Lila studied his face. The man who once hid behind grief now stood with his boots planted in the dirt and a quiet fire in his eyes. There was strength in him again, reclaimed, not borrowed. The sound of hooves approached from the west trail. Both turned sharply, hands instinctively, moving toward weapons they no longer left at the house. But it was only Clara riding hard coat, flapping behind her. She pulled up, dismounted fast. Sheriff found tracks heading toward the old Miller property, she said. Said we're not the only ones that got hit. 3 other ranches had fences cut, livestock stolen. One man's missing 2 steers. Elias muttered something under his breath. So it's a sweep. Coordinated. Clara nodded. Sheriff's forming a group to patrol tonight. Wants us in. Lila's heart skipped. That's risky. It's necessary, Elias said. Lila looked between them. What do you need from me? Elias paused. You sure you want to be part of this? I'm already part of it, she said. Besides, somebody's got to keep you 2 in one piece. That night, the barn became their command post. Clara spread out a hand-drawn map of the area on the workbench, candlelight flickering across the inked lines. Buck had returned with news the rustlers were likely locals, or at least familiar with the back trails. They moved fast, took only what they could herd quickly, and vanished before the law caught up. Elias traced a finger along the edge of the ridge. They'll come from here again. It's the fastest route. Less patrols, less light. Clara nodded. We set up a blind near the pass. Wait and watch. Lila leaned over the map. We need a second pair of eyes near the Miller place. If they're using that as a base, someone should be listening. Buck raised an eyebrow. You volunteering, I know how to stay quiet, she said. And I know how to shoot. Elias didn't argue. He just looked at her with something close to pride. They split off near midnight. The wind had picked up again, bringing with it the scent of snow. Lila crouched low beneath the pines near the Miller property, wrapped in Elias's coat, again rifle nestled against her chest. Every sound in the woods carried weight, an owl hooting a twig, snapping a far-off rustle of something large moving through the trees. Her breath fogged in front of her, and she forced herself to stay calm. She wasn't the same woman who'd stepped off a bus in a borrowed coat. She wasn't running anymore. She was holding the wire. A flicker of movement near the old barn caught her eye. Then another. She raised the rifle slowly, heart pounding. 2 figures. Quiet. Too quiet. They were rustlers. She didn't fire. Not yet. She waited, counted their steps, watched the way they moved. These weren't amateurs. They knew where to walk, what to avoid. One of them signaled with a gloved hand, pointing toward the tree line toward her. She slipped back behind the trunk, heart now thundering in her ears. She clicked the signal device. Elias had given her a small radio transmitter with a single button. 1 click, danger spotted. She clicked it twice. Footsteps approached, then stopped. Silence. Then a voice, low, cold. We know you're out here. Lila's fingers tightened on the rifle. The silence that followed was unbearable. And then hoofbeats. Fast. Clara's mare burst through the brush, rifle in hand. Move, Lila rolled and fired. 1 rustler ducked. The other bolted. Behind them, Elias and Buck emerged like ghosts from the dark. Shots rang out. Then stillness. By dawn, the sheriff had them in cuffs. The stolen cattle were found tied up near the canyon pass. The rustlers weren't locals after all, but hired hands. Men paid to stir trouble, scout weaknesses. Back at the ranch, the fire was lit and coffee brewed stronger than usual. Lila sat beside it, exhausted hands trembling not from fear, but from relief. Elias brought her a mug, then sat beside her. You all right? She nodded. Still standing, he smiled. You didn't run. Didn't want to, she whispered. This place, you... Clara Buck, it's more home than I've ever known. He reached over, took her hand, rough and scarred like his own. You don't rebuild a broken fence with hope, he said softly. You do it with wire sweat and someone willing to hold the other end. She squeezed his hand gently. Then let's keep holding on. The wind howled outside, but inside they didn't flinch. They were wired in together. Sometimes it ain't about fixing what's broken, it's about deciding what's worth building next. The last of the snow had melted into the soil, softening the earth and leaving behind patches of stubborn mud that clung to boots and wheels alike. Spring came late in the hills, and though the sun had returned, the wind still held its bite. But around the ranch, something else had started to thaw. Lila stood at the edge of the field with a fence blueprint tucked under one arm and a new coil of wire balanced on her hip. She stared across the pasture where a new line would run stronger, straighter, and built to last. The old fencing had done its time patchworked and fraying, not unlike the life she'd arrived with. But this was the start of something different. Elias approached from the barn, rolling up his sleeves, hat low over his brow. You ready? He asked, jerking his chin toward the stakes she'd already planted. Been ready, she said, planting her boot into the earth. They worked in sync, moving from post to post. Lila measured and held Elias hammered and wired. Their silences were no longer awkward. They were companionable, filled with the quiet knowledge of mutual trust. Every clink of the hammer was a rhythm, a heartbeat, a sign that something solid was taking root. By midday, Clara came down from the ridge, hair wind-blown and cheeks flushed. Sheriff says charges stuck. They're not getting out anytime soon. Good Elias grunted, driving another nail in. Better than good, Clara said, reaching for the canteen. Word's gotten around. Folks are calling it gutsy what we did. They're talking about rebuilding the co-op, pooling resources for better patrol's security. Think they're tired of feeling picked off one at a time. Lila wiped sweat from her brow. So we're becoming a community again. Looks like it, Clara said, and then with a smirk. And you might just be the unofficial ringleader. Lila laughed, shaking her head. Never led anything but my own mistakes. Then you're perfect for the job, Clara replied with a wink. Later that evening, with the fence line done for the day, Lila wandered the edge of the orchard, where the old apple trees stood gnarled and gray. Some were still barren, stripped by age and storms, but here and there buds had begun to bloom, tiny, stubborn signs of life. Buck found her there, a new saddle slung over his shoulder. Heard from town, he said. Your brother's been trying to reach you. Lila stiffened. What for, didn't say. Left a message with the general store clerk, though. Said it was about your mama's place. Her stomach turned. She hadn't thought about that house in months. Hadn't wanted to. I don't owe them anything. No, you don't, Buck agreed. But you might want to hear him out. He asked if you were doing okay. Sounded real different from how you described him. Lila's jaw tightened. People say a lot of things when they need something. Or when they finally figure out they were wrong, Buck said gently. She didn't answer. Just stared at the budding branches overhead. The next morning, she saddled up early, leaving before breakfast. The ride to town was long, quiet, and filled with every kind of memory she thought she'd buried. The roads near her mama's house still had that same dust, the same cracked fences, the same feel of something once good, now left to rot. She didn't stop at the house. She rode straight to the general store and found the clerk, who handed her a folded note. Her brother's handwriting was sloppy but familiar. Lila, if you're reading this, it means you came. I'm sorry. I was awful. I blamed you for things that were never yours to carry. Mama's gone now and the house is falling apart. I don't want anything from you. I just wanted to say thank you for everything you did for her, for us. If you ever want to talk, I'm here. Ben, she stood there for a long moment, the paper trembling in her hand. A part of her wanted to tear it in half. Another part wanted to cry. But instead she folded it neatly, tucked it into her coat, and walked back outside. The town hadn't changed much, but she had. She returned to the ranch by dusk. Clara met her at the porch. "Everything all right, I think so," Lila said. They walked together to the barn where Elias was mending a bridle. He looked up, something unspoken passing between them. "You gonna tell us what that ride was about?" he asked. "Family," she said simply. "I didn't go to fix anything. Just needed to see how much I'd already built here." Elias nodded slowly. "Sometimes it ain't about fixing what's broken. It's about deciding what's worth building next." Lila smiled. Exactly. They ate dinner together in the main house that night. Lila, Elias, Clara, and Buck. A storm rolled in soft and distant rain, tapping at the windows, while laughter filled the kitchen. The walls, once echoing with grief and silence, now rang with warmth. After the plates were cleared, Elias pulled out an old tin box from the side cabinet. Inside were plans, drawings he and his late wife had made for expanding the barn, planting new orchards, fencing in the north slope. "I was going to bury these," he said, voice low. "Didn't think I'd ever want to pick up where we left off." Lila reached for the top sheet. "Looks like we've got work to do." Outside, the rain kept falling soft and steady, soaking into the ground, and beneath it seeds stirred of trees, of fences, of futures not yet lived. The ranch, like its people, was beginning to grow again. Not in the shadow of what was lost, but in the light of what could be. He didn't say he loved her not with words, but he built her a home, and in every nail she could feel it. The wind rolled over the ridge in soft waves, carrying the scent of damp earth and blooming sage. Spring had taken full hold, and with it came a rush of newness, green shoots pushing through dark soil, birds singing in early chorus, the hum of bees threading through wildflowers. Lila knelt in the garden bed behind the ranch house, dirt smudging her arms as she planted new roots. Her fingers worked steady and sure, tucking life into place with the same care she'd come to know from Elias. Rows of squash and beans nestled alongside herbs and hardy tomatoes. There was something sacred in it, this tending to things that would feed them later, things she might have once believed were out of reach. From the barn, Elias's low voice drifted across the yard. He was talking to Buck about the expansion project materials, ordered posts, set the east gate to be realigned before the summer heat hit. His voice, once so gravel-thick with silence, now carried with it purpose, even ease. When he approached her boots crunching in the gravel path, Lila glanced up and shaded her eyes. "We're short a few boards for the south shed," he said. "Thinking I'll run into town. I can go with you." She offered brushing soil from her palms onto her jeans. He looked down at her for a long moment, then gave a quiet nod. "Wouldn't mind that." The ride into town was quieter than usual. Not uncomfortable, just filled with the kind of silence that meant things didn't need to be spoken to be understood. Elias drove with one hand on the wheel, the other resting on the window edge, eyes flicking across the fields, stretching out beside the road. "Ben reach out again?" he asked after a while. Lila nodded. "He sent another letter. Just updates. Sounds like he's trying to fix the old place up. You think you'll go see it?" She shrugged. "Maybe. One day. But I ain't in a hurry to look backward." He grunted. "Some places are just meant to stay in the rear view." They pulled up outside the lumberyard just past noon. While Elias loaded the boards, Lila wandered to the side lot, where salvaged windows and doors leaned in uneven stacks. Her fingers trailed over a frame weathered oak, the glass long gone but the joints still strong. "You building something?" the owner asked, stepping out of his office with a clipboard in hand. "Thinking about it," she said. Elias joined her just then. "She's got the eye for solid things." The owner chuckled. "Well, that one's from a farmhouse 2 counties over, torn down last fall. Shame, really. Still had bones." Back at the ranch, the boards were unloaded, the windows set aside. But the idea had taken root. That evening, Lila sat at the kitchen table with Buck and Clara, a roll of brown paper unfurled between them. On it were sketched lines, measurements, rough shapes of something that resembled a cabin. "Not for me," Lila said. "I'd stay in the house with Elias. But for someone else. A spare place. A start." "Like you were given," Clara said quietly. Lila nodded. "Exactly." Elias stepped in just then, catching the tail end of the conversation. He looked at the drawings but said nothing, just poured himself a cup of coffee and stood by the window watching the light fade behind the hills. That night, Lila stepped out onto the porch, where Elias was fixing a loose board on the railing. The moonlight caught the side of his face, sharp and soft all at once. "You thinking about it?" she asked. He didn't look at her. "Thinking a place like that would have helped my sister once." Lila leaned against the post. "It still can. For someone else." He set his hammer down and faced her. "You want it by the creek, don't you?" She smiled. "Wouldn't that be a view?" The building began the next day. Not fast and not all at once. Just like everything else they'd done, it happened in parts, morning hours, between chores, afternoons when the weather allowed. Elias cut the beams. Buck and Clara helped dig the foundation. Lila picked out windows from the salvage yard, each pane like a frame to a new possibility. Word got out, too. Folks from nearby ranches stopped by to help. A man named Luther brought extra nails. Miss Helen from the church brought sandwiches and stayed to plant flowers near the path. Even Sheriff Dorsey swung by to offer his boys for hauling. When asked what the cabin was, for Lila never said a name. She didn't have one. Just said, "It's for someone who needs it when the time comes." As the walls went up and the roof took shape, Lila realized something surprising. Elias hadn't just agreed to the cabin. He'd poured himself into it. Every board he cut was precise. Every beam measured twice. He hand-carved the front door, built shelves into the walls, made a bed frame from a split pine log. One afternoon, she found him sanding a window frame, fingers stained with varnish, eyes softer than she'd ever seen. "You always build this careful?" she asked. He glanced up, a faint smile at the corner of his mouth. "Not always. Why now?" He didn't answer right away. Just looked out toward the hills. "Because this matters," he finally said. "Because you do." And just like that, her chest tightened. He didn't say he loved her, not with words, but he built her a home, and in every nail she could feel it. When the cabin was finished, they stood in the doorway side by side. The wood was still fresh, the scent of pine thick in the air. The glass in the windows caught the sunset just right, turning the whole place gold. "It's beautiful," she whispered. He nodded. "It's yours." She looked at him, startled. "I said I'd stay in the house," I know, he interrupted. "But this isn't just a place. It's a promise. That nobody who finds themselves where you once were will ever have to feel alone." Her hand reached for his, and he didn't let go. As dusk fell over the ranch and the first stars blinked to life, Lila knew this wasn't just about healing anymore. It was about offering that healing forward, about creating something lasting. The cabin stood as proof, and so did the man who built it. She didn't need a crown or a title, she only needed the strength to stand and the love to keep standing. The cabin by the creek had become more than wood and nails. In just a few months, it breathed with purpose. A rocking chair rested on the porch, hand-built by Elias and sanded smooth by Laya. Inside the bed was dressed with a patchwork quilt. Clara had stitched each square a piece of warmth, donated from someone who believed in second chances. Laya stood in the doorway one morning, arms folded as she looked out over the slow-moving water. Spring had turned to early summer, and the breeze that stirred her hair carried the soft murmur of bees and wildflowers. The world was green and alive, yet something inside her stirred like a restless current under the calm. She was proud of the work, of the home she had helped build, of the quiet steadiness she'd earned. But part of her still wrestled with the weight of old words, the scars of never being enough. In her father's eyes, the shame that had once clung to her like second skin. That day, a wagon rolled down the gravel path toward the ranch house, carrying a family of 4, a man with tired eyes, a young mother with a baby on her hip, and 2 children who clung to the edges of the seat, faces pale with exhaustion. Laya and Elias were in the barn when the wheels crunched to a stop. Clara stepped out to greet them first. "You must be the Daltons. You made it." The man removed his hat. "Barely. We lost a wheel back in Junction. Took 2 extra days." Elias came forward, wiping his hands on a rag. "Come on in. We've got fresh water, food, and a place to rest." Laya watched as the young mother's shoulders dropped, her eyes shimmering. "Thank you," she whispered. The cabin by the creek was theirs now, at least for a time. It wasn't meant to be permanent, just a beginning, a bridge from hardship to hope. And as they unpacked what little they owned, Laya walked the path back to the house with something new rising in her chest. Not envy, not fear, pride. That night after supper, she sat beside the fire pit while Elias repaired a bridle. The stars were starting to blink overhead, the sky velvet dark. "You were right," he said without looking up. She glanced at him. "About what? About building for someone else." I didn't know how much it'd matter until I saw her face. Laya wrapped her arms around her knees. "It's strange, isn't it? We spend so long surviving, we forget what it feels like to give." He set the bridle aside and leaned back. "You've given more than you know, Laya." The words caught her off guard. For a moment she just looked at him, the firelight flickering across his face. "I keep thinking about my father," she said finally. "About all the things he never saw in me. I used to think if I could just be good enough, work hard enough, he'd finally say he was proud. But he never did." Elias didn't interrupt. "And now? It doesn't matter as much. I've made peace with it. But there's still this ache sometimes, like I'm chasing something I'll never catch." He reached over, slow and steady, and took her hand. "You've stopped chasing him, Laya. That's the difference. You're building your own life now, not one to win someone's approval." Her throat tightened. She nodded, eyes misting. "It feels free." The next morning, Clara handed Laya an envelope at the breakfast table. "Came in with the mail from town. Looks like it's from your father's estate lawyer." Laya took it slowly, fingers brushing over the envelope's edge. The seal was crisp, the handwriting neat. She turned it over once, then opened it. Inside was a formal letter, a single sheet folded into thirds. It informed her that the estate had been settled, that her father's land had been sold off, the debts paid, and the remaining funds distributed per his final instructions. There were no surprises, no apologies, just facts, final and cold. At the bottom in smaller print was a line to Miss Lila Grace Harper. "A remaining balance of $327.40 has been dispersed." No note, no acknowledgement, just that. She stared at it for a long while. then folded it again, slowly and carefully. When Elias found her out by the fence line later that afternoon, she handed him the envelope without a word. He read it, then folded it again and gave it back. "You okay?" he asked. She nodded. "I am. I really am." He squinted at her. "Doesn't feel like much justice." "It isn't," she said. "But justice ain't always loud. Sometimes it's just not needing their approval anymore. Sometimes it's waking up and realizing you built something they could never take away." Elias nodded. "You did." Later that evening, Lila walked the path to the creek and sat on the porch of the little cabin. The Dalton children were inside giggling over a game of dominoes. The mother was washing clothes in the copper basin. And the father, now rested, was mending a shoe by lamplight. They looked like she once had tired but ready, hurt but not hopeless. She sat there for a long while. Then rising, she stepped inside, helped fold the laundry, swept the floor, and tucked one of the children into bed when he nodded off by the fire. And when she returned to the big house, Elias had already turned down the lantern and opened the bedroom window to let in the cool night air. She slid into bed beside him, the silence comfortable, the world settled. "You know," he said softly in the dark, "I think your father got it all wrong." She smiled, eyes closing. "How's that?" Thought he was building a legacy through land and control. But he didn't see what real strength looks like. And what does it look like? He turned toward her. "It looks like you." A tear slid down her cheek, but she didn't wipe it away. She didn't need a crown or a title, she only needed the strength to stand and the love to keep standing. And finally, she had both. Sometimes the most powerful thing a person can do is stay when every part of them wants to run. The late summer heat had begun to retreat, leaving a golden hush over the ranch. The air felt heavier these days, not because of the weather, but because of the silence that had started to fall between Lila and Elias. It wasn't cold, not exactly. But something had shifted. Lila noticed it in the way Elias lingered a little longer outside after supper. In the way he'd smile kind but distant before turning in for the night. She told herself not to take it personally. He was busy, tired, carrying more on his shoulders than he let on. But the feeling rooted deep in her chest. She was no stranger to that silence, the one that grows when someone is pulling away, even if they don't mean to. She'd felt it with her father. She'd felt it with every man who had passed through her life, with polite intentions and shallow affections. But Elias wasn't like them. At least she hoped he wasn't. Clara noticed, of course. She always did. "You've been pacing holes in the floorboards," Clara said, as she poured 2 mugs of coffee that morning. Lila looked up, startled. "I have not." "You have. Since yesterday." Lila took a sip, then stared out the kitchen window toward the barn. Elias was hauling feed, his shoulders tense, his movements sharp. "He's been off," Lila murmured. "Quiet, preoccupied. Like there's something he's not saying." Clara sat across from her. "There usually is with men like him. Not because they want to hurt you, but because they've spent too long keeping their pain to themselves. Like it's safer locked away." Lila's voice dropped. "What if it has to do with me?" Clara leaned forward. "Then talk to him. Don't guess. Don't run from what you don't know." That evening, as the sky turned to rose and gold, Lila walked down the path to the barn. Elias was in the tack room, cleaning a bit with more force than necessary. He didn't look up when she stepped inside. "Supper was good. Thanks," she said. "You barely touched yours." "I wasn't hungry." A pause. "I need to ask you something, Elias." He set the bit down and finally met her eyes. "What's going on?" He sighed, rubbing the back of his neck. I figured you'd ask sooner or later. I've been trying not to push, I know, he said softly. That's why it's even harder. She stepped closer, her voice steadier than she felt. Just tell me. Elias looked down at his hands. There's a man who came by the feed store a couple weeks back. Said he used to know you. From back east. Said some things, ugly things. Lila's stomach turned. Who didn't give a name? Said you were a mail-order bride down on your luck. That you'd been passed around before. That I should be careful who I let under my roof. She went still. It wasn't the first time she'd heard whispers like that. But hearing it from Elias, hearing that someone had dragged her past across the country to poison what she'd built, it broke something in her. I see, she said, swallowing hard. I didn't believe him, Elias said quickly. Not really. But I'd be lying if I said it didn't rattle me. I got quiet because I didn't know how to talk about it without making you feel ashamed. Tears pricked at the corners of her eyes, but she didn't let them fall, Elias. I've never lied to you about who I am. I never claimed to be anything more than a woman who's lost things, who's made mistakes. But I never lied. I know, he said. That's what I keep coming back to. Then why pull away from me? He stepped toward her, voice thick. Because I didn't want you to see how much it hurt me. Not what he said about you, but that someone could look at you and only see your worst day. And because a part of me is still learning that I don't need to protect myself from people who love me. Lila's breath hitched. You think I don't carry shame too? Elias went on. You think I haven't done things I regret I built this place to hide from all that. But you came here and made it mean something again. And I got scared I'd mess it all up. She reached for his hand. You haven't. The silence stretched between them again, but this time it was filled with understanding, not fear. I don't want to run anymore, she whispered. Not from the past, not from you, not from this life. He nodded, pulling her into his arms. Then don't. Stay. Stay with me. She closed her eyes against his chest. I was always staying, even when it hurt. Later they sat under the stars on the porch. The warmth between them returned quiet and steady, no longer weighed down by unspoken things. Lila rested her head on his shoulder. He came all this way just to try and break me. He didn't, Elias said. No, she agreed. He didn't. And when the wind picked up, rustling the trees and carrying the scent of wild sage across the land, she finally understood the depth of her own roots. She hadn't just stayed. She had stood. And she wasn't alone anymore. They tried to bury her with her past, but she bloomed right through it. The morning sun split the horizon wide open with gold casting light over the earth like a baptism. Lila stood on the porch with a basket of herbs freshly cut from the small garden she and Clara had been tending together. The cool air hinted at the coming of autumn, and with it a sense of finality, a turning of pages. It had been a week since Elias shared the story of the stranger who came to poison her place in this new life. A week since she had chosen to stand, not run. And in that week, something in her had shifted. Not just in her bones, not just in her thoughts, but in her very spirit. She was done apologizing for surviving. Clara stepped out onto the porch behind her, wrapping a shawl around her shoulders. You've been quiet this morning. Lila gave her a soft smile. I've been thinking. That can be dangerous. Clara teased, then turned serious. You all right? I am, Lila said. I think I'm finally all right. She looked toward the barn where Elias and young Micah were working on a new gate. Elias had offered the boy work, when he saw him loitering around the trading post, skinny and wary, all elbows and mistrust. Lila had seen the same thing in him that she once saw in herself, someone waiting for a reason to believe people could be good. The ranch was becoming something bigger than just a place to hide. It was growing into a place that could heal. Slowly, gently, day by day. Clara followed her gaze. He listens to you, Micah, no Elias, she said. Though Micah does too. That man Elias, he's different since you arrived. Lila shook her head, humbled. He's been patient, kind, more than I ever expected, more than I thought I deserved. Clara gave her a look. Stop that. Stop acting like you were born in debt. You paid your dues, more than most. Lila lowered her eyes. People still whisper. They always will. Let 'em. Let 'em whisper while you live a life they'll never have the courage to chase. Later that afternoon, as Lila walked toward the trading post for flour and canning jars, she noticed the way people shifted. Some greeted her politely, a few with genuine warmth. Others gave her tight smiles, their eyes dipping to the ground after meeting hers. It didn't sting like it used to. Inside the store, the owner, Mr. Rigsby, was chatting with a couple of older women near the counter. Their conversation quieted as she approached, but she caught the tail of it, her name, and the phrase mail order said with a curl of the lip. Lila didn't flinch. She gathered her items, placed them on the counter, and waited as Rigsby tallied them without looking her in the eye. How's the ranch? He muttered. Thriving, she answered smoothly. The hens are laying, the orchard's taken root, and Elias has been smiling more. One of the women sniffed. We all thought he'd stay alone. Quiet. Now look at him hosting barn dances, hiring strays. Lila tilted her head. Funny how love does that. Brings dead places back to life. The register rang with finality. She dropped coins on the counter, then added, You can keep the change, Mr. Rigsby. Maybe invest it in kindness. She left with her head high and her back straight, walking past the wagging tongues like they were dust in the wind. As she returned home, Micah was sitting on the fence with a grin. You look like you just won a duel. In a way, she said, handing him a stick of peppermint she'd picked up for him. Some battles are quiet, but they matter. He nodded solemnly and tucked the candy into his pocket. That night, Elias found her out by the old oak tree near the back of the property, where the view of the valley stretched wide and unbroken. The stars had begun to blink overhead, scattered like God's own freckles. You handled yourself well in town, he said, his voice low, a touch amused. You heard already, word travels fast out here, he replied, especially when it involves a woman standing her ground. She glanced at him, a trace of shyness still lingering. Did I embarrass you? He stepped closer, slipping an arm around her waist. You made me proud. They stood together in the hush of twilight, her head resting against his chest, the beat of his heart like a metronome ticking steady in her ear. I've been thinking, he murmured. Dangerous, she teased. I'm serious, Lila. You've changed this place. You've changed me. I spent so long thinking I needed to stay quiet, to stay safe. But maybe safety isn't silence. Maybe it's standing next to someone who'll fight beside you. She smiled against his shoulder. I don't know about fighting, but I make a mean rhubarb pie. That too, he chuckled. But I mean it. I want folks to know what you mean to me. I want the whispers to stop because the truth is louder. Her breath caught. Are you saying I want to marry you, Lila? He said. Not as a grand gesture, not on one knee, but with the calm certainty of a man who had already decided. If you'll have me. Tears welled, but she blinked them back. I've always been yours. From the moment you opened your door to a stranger, and asked her to stay. He kissed her, then slow, reverent, sealing a promise spoken by their hearts long before their lips ever formed the words. The wind rustled through the leaves as if the land itself had been holding its breath and now exhaled in relief. They would announce it soon. Not for the town, not to hush the rumors, but for themselves. To declare openly and without shame that something good had bloomed from the ashes. And there beneath the open sky, Lila finally believed she was worth something more than survival. She was worth staying for. She was worth loving. I didn't just survive, I built a life, and I'll fight for it with both hands and my whole heart. The news of their engagement didn't ripple through town. It cracked like thunder. Some folks welcomed it with quiet nods, warm handshakes, and the soft sighs of people who'd waited for something good to come out of the wilderness. Others predictably made a sport out of their disapproval, whispering through pursed lips and folded arms, spitting out the word bride like it was a curse. Lila had expected it. What she didn't expect was how little it bothered her now. Because she wasn't the same woman who'd stepped off that train months ago. The weeks leading to the wedding had been a whirlwind of preparations. Clara took charge like a general, bustling through fabric swatches and flower arrangements, while Micah built benches for the ceremony, with a pride that turned his lanky frame into something solid. The ranch became a hive of movement and purpose, neighbors bringing pies and bolts of linen, men offering to help set up lanterns, women sewing ribbons with practiced hands. Even old Mrs. Halperin, who had once refused to make eye contact with Lila at the mercantile, came by with a bundle of lavender and a stiff smile. Lila worked alongside them all. She kneaded dough, hemmed her own dress, repaired the edge of the barn roof that had taken a beating in the last storm. She didn't want to sit still. The stillness brought back shadows, and there wasn't room for shadows anymore. But just when it all seemed to settle into peace, the past returned again. It came in the form of a letter. Elias had found it tucked in with the feed delivery. The envelope was worn, the handwriting sharp and precise. He held it out to Lila without a word. Her hands trembled slightly as she opened it. The paper crackled. Lila, it seems you've found yourself a new life. Word travels. I'll make this plain, your past isn't something you can outrun. And if you think marriage to some backwoods rancher makes you respectable, think again. You owe me, and you know why. I'll be coming through soon. We can handle this quiet-like. Or I can make things difficult. Your choice. No name, just a scrawled symbol at the bottom. A crooked M, the mark of Malcolm Finn, the man who'd once owned her debt. Her silence, her soul. Lila folded the letter slowly. Her chest was tight, but not from fear. Not anymore. It was rage, and it was clarity. She turned to Elias. He's coming. He said nothing for a beat. Then, we're not running. No, she agreed. We're not. He watched her face, her jaw clenched in resolve. You're not that girl anymore. No, she said again more firmly. And I'm not hiding who I am. That night she sat with Clara and told her everything, the debt, the escape, the threats. The woman who had taken her in without question finally knew the weight she'd carried. Clara's response was a cup of strong coffee and a hand on her knee. Honey, you survived a man like that. You don't owe him a single breath. Micah heard bits of the conversation and stood by the door like a silent guard dog. You want me to keep watch near the post road, he offered. I still know how to move without being seen. Lila smiled softly. You're too young to carry this. I ain't a child, he said. And this place, it's the first home I've had. I'll do what it takes to keep it. The next morning she rode into town with Elias and posted a letter to the local marshal in Butte asking for advice. She handed it across the counter without flinching, her name signed clearly at the bottom. No more secrets. The store was quiet, but she knew word would spread. It always did. And that was fine. If Malcolm was coming, let him see the kind of woman she had become. Let him know she didn't stand alone anymore. Back at the ranch, she worked harder than ever. She scrubbed the kitchen until it gleamed, organized every shelf, baked loaves of bread for the neighbors, as if the rhythm of daily life could armor her against what was coming. But deep inside, her pulse beat steady with a new kind of strength. She hadn't just found a new life, she had built it with her own hands. The night before her wedding, the ranch was lit with lanterns casting warm light across the porch and out into the fields. Friends and neighbors had come to offer blessings. Fiddle music danced in the air, children ran barefoot, laughter rising like smoke. Elias stood beside her, hand at the small of her back, his touch a steady reminder that she was no longer alone in her battles. Clara made a toast with a mason jar of cider. To Lila and Elias, proof that good things can bloom in hard soil. And then, as if summoned by the shadows of her past, a rider approached on a dark horse, cutting through the music like a knife. He wore black. His face bore the years, cruelly, each line etched by control, greed, and bitterness. His eyes scanned the gathering with a predator's gleam. Lila stepped down from the porch before Elias could move. "Evening, Malcolm," she said, her voice calm, firm. He dismounted with a sneer. "Didn't think you'd greet me so publicly. I've got nothing to hide." He looked around at the crowd that had begun to hush. "You're brave, I'll give you that. But brave doesn't cancel debt." "You're right," she said. "But you're wrong about something else." "Oh, I'm not afraid of you, and I'm not the girl you used to own." She turned toward the porch and raised her voice. "This man is Malcolm Finn. Years ago he trapped me in debt and ruin. He made his money ruining women's lives. I escaped, and now he's here threatening me again." There was a long silence. Then Clara stepped down beside her. "So you came all this way to threaten a bride on the eve of her wedding," she said, voice sharp as broken glass. "Real noble of you." Micah appeared from the shadows, a rifle casually slung over his shoulder. "Might want to turn around, mister. You're not welcome here." Malcolm looked from one face to another, realizing no one would back down for him. No one would flinch. Elias stepped forward, last, his arm wrapping around Lila's waist. "She's not yours to haunt anymore. She never was." Malcolm's sneer faltered, then collapsed. He turned back to his horse and rode off, swallowed by the dark. The silence held until he was gone. Then slowly, music began again. Lila exhaled, her body trembling not in fear, but in release. She leaned into Elias. "I didn't just survive," she whispered. "I built a life. And I'll spend mine making sure it stays safe," he answered. She looked around at the people, clapping, laughing again, as if the night had simply continued on without pause. But she knew better. Something important had happened tonight. She had claimed her story in full light, and no man could ever take that from her again. "The life I have now, it's not just a second chance. It's the real one I was always meant to live." The morning light bathed the ranch in gold, a soft promise hanging in the air as the final preparations for the wedding began. Lila stood by the window, brushing her fingers over the simple lace veil Clara had stitched just days before. She breathed in deeply, the scent of coffee and fresh bread wafting through the walls, a reminder that life at its core was built on small, solid things. Today was the day. Downstairs, the household buzzed like a hive. Clara was orchestrating everything with her usual stern grace, directing Micah to carry crates of preserves and instructing neighbors on where to lay the floral garlands. Elias had gone out to the east pasture earlier, needing a moment alone with the horses, with the wind, with his thoughts. Lila watched from the porch as guests began arriving, riders from neighboring ranches, townsfolk on foot, old Miss Jeannie in her patched-up wagon. Each face that stepped through the gate carried warmth and curiosity, but none more important than the one who appeared just as the sun climbed overhead. A man with a gray beard and worn hands stepped down from a buckboard wagon, removing his hat with hesitant reverence. It was Thomas the preacher who'd helped her once in a different town, a different life. Her breath caught in her throat. Clara, noticing the stillness in Lila, approached. "You all right?" Lila nodded slowly. "I asked for someone who knew me before, to witness this." Thomas approached and bowed his head. "Miss Lila, you sent word. I came." Tears prickled her eyes. "You didn't have to." "I did," he said gently, "because today you're not just getting married. You're reclaiming something that was taken. And the Lord knows I wanted to see that day come." The ceremony was held in the meadow beyond the barn, where wildflowers nodded in the breeze and the river sang softly in the distance. Lanterns hung from fence posts. The benches Micah had built were filled with folks dressed in their best, and children sat wide-eyed in their parents' laps. Lila walked down the short aisle on her own. No one gave her away because no one owned her. The wind tugged at her skirt, as if nature itself was ushering her forward. Elias stood beneath the arch they'd built together, his jacket a bit wrinkled, his boots dusty. But his eyes, those steady, warm eyes, held the kind of promise that couldn't be bought or borrowed, only earned. Thomas cleared his throat and began the vows with a voice full of gravel and grace. "Do you, Elias Mercer, take this woman, once a stranger, now your heart's anchor, to be your lawfully wedded wife?" "I do," Elias said without hesitation. "And you, Lila Ray, once adrift, now rooted. Do you take this man as your husband?" "I do," she whispered, voice strong. "Then by the covenant of heaven and the strength of your own hands and hearts, I declare you husband and wife." Elias leaned in and kissed her with such tenderness that the whole meadow seemed to hold its breath. Cheers erupted. Clara dabbed her eyes with a handkerchief. Micah whooped. Even gruff old Harlan chuckled behind his beard. Later the feast unfolded under the shade of cottonwoods. Pies lined tables, fiddles struck up songs, neighbors danced barefoot in the dirt. Lila spun in her dress, laughing with Micah, letting Clara tug her into a waltz. Elias sat with his arms slung over the back of a chair, watching her, as if trying to memorize every moment. As twilight fell, Lila found herself seated on the porch swing, watching fireflies spark across the fields. Elias joined her, holding 2 cups of sweet tea. "I still can't believe it," she said, taking the cup. "Believe it," he said. "You're here. We're here." She leaned into him, resting her head on his shoulder. "There were days I thought I'd never be safe. That love wasn't made for someone like me." His arm tightened around her. "Love doesn't look for perfection, Lila. It looks for truth. You're more truth than anyone I've ever known." The stars blinked alive above them, quiet witnesses to the life they had chosen. "I don't want to forget where I came from," she murmured. "But I don't want it to define me anymore." "It won't," Elias said. "Because the life you have now, it's not just a second chance. It's the real one you were always meant to live." Silence stretched comfortably between them, filled only by the distant sound of laughter and the wind through the grass. Behind them, Clara was telling stories to the children, her voice theatrical and full of mischief. Micah had pulled out his harmonica, playing a slow tune that drifted through the warm night. Lila closed her eyes. She felt it in her bones. Not just safety, not just survival, but belonging, joy, home. When she opened her eyes again, she found Elias watching her. What she asked, smiling, "Just thinking how long it took to find you." "Well," she said, her voice playful, "now you're a quiet man. Maybe I just had to get loud enough for you to hear me." He laughed low and easy, then stood and offered his hand. "Come dance with me, Mrs. Mercer." She took it, rising into his arms. As they moved slowly beneath the starlit sky, surrounded by their makeshift family, Lila knew there would be other storms, other letters, other ghosts, other reckonings. But there would also be mornings with fresh bread and quiet moments on the porch swing and hands to hold in the dark. Because this life, this one, they had built it together. And it was theirs to keep. The educational lesson learned from this story is that life does not end when hardship takes something from us. It often begins again when we choose to stand instead of retreat. Dignity is built through daily acts of courage, honest work, and the willingness to let others see us as we truly are. No matter one's age or past, it is never too late to build a home, form deep bonds, or claim a life shaped by purpose rather than regret. Healing comes not from erasing the past, but from living well enough that it no longer controls the present.